She carried no identification badge. She wore no uniform with rank insignia. But when they threw her out for saving lives, a 5-star Admiral discovered a classified file that would shake the very foundations of Riverside Memorial Hospital. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Elena Vasquez moved silently through the emergency ward at 3:47 a.m. Her scrubs were simple forest green cotton that had seen better days, with small coffee stains near the pocket where she kept her stethoscope. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, secured with a simple elastic band that had lost its grip hours ago. Strands fell across her tired face as she leaned over Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had been waiting in the overcrowded EO for nearly 6 hours. "The pain is getting worse, dear," Mrs. Patterson whispered, clutching Elena's hand with surprising strength. "They keep saying someone will see me soon, but ... Elena glanced around the chaotic emergency room of Riverside Memorial Hospital in downtown Millbrook. 23 patients filled a space designed for 15. 3 nurses rushed between beds, their faces etched with exhaustion and frustration. The on-call physician, Dr. Kenneth Rothwell, sat behind the nurses' station, more interested in his phone than the growing line of patients who needed immediate attention. "I know, Mrs. Patterson," Elena said softly, adjusting the woman's pillow. "Let me take a look." What the staff at Riverside Memorial didn't know, what nobody in this small Ohio town knew, was that Elena Vasquez wasn't just another volunteer who showed up to help during the night shift. She wasn't the community college dropout that her simple appearance suggested. She was someone whose very presence in this hospital was governed by protocol so classified that only a handful of people in the entire country had clearance to know her true identity. Elena had been coming to Riverside Memorial for 3 months, now arriving after midnight when the skeleton crew struggled to handle the influx of patients. She told the head nurse, Janet Morrison, that she was a former nursing student who wanted to volunteer her time. Janet, desperate for help during the understaffed night shifts, had gratefully accepted Elena's offer without asking too many questions. After all, Elena never asked for payment, never demanded recognition, and somehow always knew exactly what to do in medical emergencies. Tonight was no different. Elena moved from bed to bed with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen far worse than anything Riverside Memorial could offer. She checked vitals, administered basic care, and provided comfort to patients who had been forgotten in the chaos of an overwhelmed emergency room. Her hands were steady as she adjusted IV drips, gentle as she cleaned wounds, and precise as she monitored heart rates and blood pressure. "Elena," called Maria Santos, one of the night nurses, "can you help me with the gentleman in bed 7? He's been having chest pains for the past hour." Elena nodded and made her way to bed 7, where a middle-aged construction worker named Tony DeLuca lay clutching his chest. His face was pale, sweating despite the cool hospital air. Elena took one look at him and immediately recognized the signs. This wasn't just heartburn or anxiety. This was a heart attack in progress. She quickly checked his pulse, noting the irregular rhythm, and examined his symptoms with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with cardiac emergencies in far more challenging conditions than a fully equipped hospital. Tony's breathing was shallow, his skin had a grayish tint, and the pain was clearly radiating down his left arm. "Maria," Elena said urgently, "we need to get him to the cardiac unit immediately. This is an active me." Maria looked confused. "Me?" "Elena, you're just a volunteer. Maybe we should wait for Dr. Rothwell to—" "There's no time," Elena interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. "Get the crash cart and call the cardiac team now. His street elevation is textbook. We have maybe 10 minutes before this becomes critical." For a moment, Maria hesitated. Elena was just a volunteer, after all. She had no medical degree that anyone knew about, no official training that appeared on any hospital records. But there was something in Elena's voice, something in the way she moved with absolute certainty. That made Maria trust her instincts. As Maria rushed to get help, Elena stayed with Tony, monitoring his condition and keeping him calm. She spoke to him in quiet, reassuring tones, explaining what was happening and what the medical team would do to help him. Her knowledge of cardiac procedures was extensive, her explanations precise, and her bedside manner that of someone who had spent years in high-stakes medical situations. "You're going to be fine, Tony," she said, checking his pulse again. "The team is coming, and they're going to take excellent care of you. Just focus on breathing steadily for me." Within minutes, the cardiac team arrived and whisked Tony away to the cardiac catheterization lab. Later, the attending cardiologist would report that Elena's quick diagnosis and immediate response had saved Tony's life. Another 20 minutes, and the heart attack would have been fatal. But tonight, Elena simply watched them wheel Tony away, then quietly returned to checking on Mrs. Patterson and the other patients who still needed care. She moved through the emergency room like a ghost, helping where she could, offering comfort where medical intervention wasn't needed, and always staying in the background. At 6:30 a.m., as the day shift began to arrive, Elena gathered her simple canvas bag and prepared to leave. She had been at the hospital for nearly 8 hours, had helped save a man's life, and had provided care to dozens of patients. She asked for nothing in return, no recognition, no payment, no official acknowledgement of her contributions. "Thank you, Elena," Janet Morrison said as she passed the nurse's station. "I don't know what we'd do without you," Elena smiled tiredly. "Just doing what I can, Janet. See you tomorrow night." As she walked out of Riverside Memorial Hospital into the early morning sunlight, Elena pulled her jacket tight around her shoulders. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a kind-hearted woman who volunteered her time to help others. No one would have guessed that hidden in a classified file in a secured government facility, her real identity was known to only a select few at the highest levels of military and medical command. No one would have guessed that her simple act of compassion was about to trigger a chain of events that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What the staff at Riverside Memorial Hospital didn't know, what nobody in the quiet town of Millbrook could have possibly imagined, was that Elena Vasquez was living under a carefully constructed cover identity that had taken the Department of Defense 3 years to perfect. Her real name was Dr. Elena Catherine Vasquez Restrepo, and she held the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Navy Medical Corps. More specifically, she was one of only 12 people in the world certified in Advanced Tactical Combat Medicine and Biological Warfare Response classification, so sensitive that her very existence was known only to a select group of Pentagon officials and military medical command. For the past 15 years, Elena had served in the most dangerous medical assignments the military could offer. She had performed emergency surgery in bombed-out field hospitals in Afghanistan while under active fire. She had treated victims of chemical weapons attacks in classified locations across 3 continents. She had spent 2 years embedded with Special Operations Forces, providing medical support for missions that would never appear in any official records. Her expertise wasn't just in traditional medicine. Elena was a specialist in treating injuries and illnesses that most doctors would never encounter in a lifetime of practice. She had developed new protocols for treating exotic toxin exposure, had pioneered field surgery techniques that were now standard practice in combat zones, and had written the definitive military manual on emergency medical response in hostile environments. But 6 months ago, Elena's world had collapsed in a way that no amount of military training could have prepared her for. During a classified medical mission in Eastern Europe, Elena had been exposed to an experimental biological agent while treating infected civilians. The exposure hadn't killed her. Years of immunizations and medical countermeasures had prevented that, but it had triggered a rare autoimmune response that left her with intermittent episodes of severe fatigue and muscle weakness. The condition wasn't life-threatening, but it was unpredictable. Elena might feel perfectly normal for weeks, then suddenly find herself barely able to stand for more than a few minutes. For someone whose job required split-second decisions and perfect physical coordination in life-or-death situations, condition was career-ending. The Navy had offered her a medical discharge with full honors and benefits. They had offered her a comfortable desk job at the Pentagon. They had offered her consulting positions with defense contractors where her expertise would be valued and well-compensated. Elena had turned down every offer. Instead, she had requested something unprecedented, a temporary medical leave that would allow her to serve in a civilian capacity while she underwent experimental treatment for her condition. She wanted to continue practicing medicine, but in an environment where her occasional physical limitations wouldn't put lives at risk. The request had gone all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. After months of deliberation, Elena had been granted an unusual form of inactive duty status. She would retain her security clearance and her rank, but she would be officially listed as on extended medical leave for classified health concerns. Her location and activities would be monitored by military intelligence, but she would be free to live as a civilian while she recovered. The cover story was simple. Elena Vasquez was a former nursing student who had dropped out due to family circumstances and was now volunteering at hospitals while trying to get her life back on track. Her identification documents, credit history, and background records had all been carefully constructed to support this narrative. What made the cover story believable was that it contained just enough truth to pass scrutiny. Elena did have family circumstances. Her elderly father lived in a nursing home in nearby Springfield, and she visited him twice a week. She was dealing with health issues, though their true nature was classified. And she genuinely wanted to continue helping people, even if she couldn't do so in her previous capacity. The military psychologist who had evaluated Elena before approving her leave had been concerned about her psychological adjustment to civilian life. After 15 years of high-stakes military medicine, would she be able to find fulfillment in routine civilian hospital work? Would the lack of recognition and authority be too difficult for someone accustomed to command responsibility? Elena had assured them that she understood the challenges. She had told them that her only goal was to continue serving others in whatever capacity she could manage. She had promised that she would maintain her cover identity and avoid any situations that might compromise her classified status. What she hadn't told them was how deeply she missed the sense of purpose that came with her military service. She hadn't mentioned how difficult it was to watch civilian doctors make decisions that she knew were suboptimal, or to bite her tongue when she saw medical procedures being performed inefficiently. Most of all, she hadn't told them about the dreams, the nightmares, really, where she relived the medical emergencies she had handled in combat zones, where she woke up feeling like she had abandoned her post and left people to die. Working the night shift at Riverside Memorial had become Elena's way of finding peace. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital was understaffed and overwhelmed, she could use her skills to genuinely help people without the weight of military protocol or the pressure of combat conditions. She could practice medicine the way she had always wanted to, focused purely on healing, without the complications of warfare and politics. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now more fulfilled working as an anonymous volunteer than she had ever been as a decorated military officer. Here, in this small-town hospital, she could remember why she had become a doctor in the first place, but Elena's sense of peace was about to be shattered. Because tomorrow morning, Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, the new chief administrator of Riverside Memorial Hospital, would arrive for his first day of work. And Dr. Blackthorne had very specific ideas about the kind of people who belonged in his hospital, ideas that would put Elena's carefully constructed cover identity and her freedom to continue helping others in serious jeopardy. Elena returned to Riverside Memorial the following evening, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder as she made her way through the employee entrance. The security guard, Jim Hendricks, waved her through with a friendly nod. After 3 months of seeing her arrive punctually at midnight, he had stopped asking for identification weeks ago. "Evening, Elena," he called out. "Janet left word that they're expecting a busy night. 3 car accident victims coming in around 2 a.m. "Thanks for the heads up, Jim," Elena replied, signing her name on the volunteer log. She had perfected the art of looking tired but determined, the perfect image of a dedicated volunteer who simply wanted to help. As she walked through the corridors toward the emergency ward, Elena's trained eyes automatically began their nightly assessment. It was a habit ingrained from years of military service. Always evaluate your environment. Always understand the tactical situation. Always be prepared for the unexpected. Tonight, she noticed subtle changes that would have escaped the attention of civilian staff. The maintenance crew had installed new security cameras in 3 locations. The computer terminals at the nurses' stations had been updated with new login protocols. Most telling of all, there were 2 additional security guards posted near the administrative offices, guards who hadn't been there yesterday. Elena filed these observations away without changing her expression or pace. In her military career, she had learned that information was often more valuable than immediate action. Sometimes the best strategy was to watch, listen, and understand the full scope of a situation before making any moves. The emergency ward was already showing signs. OF strain. Elena counted 18 patients in the waiting area, with more arriving every few minutes. The night shift was down to 2 nurses, Maria Santos, and a new nurse named Rebecca. Foster and Dr. Rothwell looked even more overwhelmed than usual. "Elena, thank God you're here," Maria called out as she spotted her. "Rebecca's only been here 2 weeks, and Dr. Rothwell is threatening to call in sick if things get any worse." Elena nodded and immediately began her rounds, but tonight she was observing more than just medical conditions. She was studying the hospital's operational weaknesses, its staffing patterns, and its decision-making processes. What she saw confirmed her growing concerns about Riverside Memorial's ability to handle serious medical emergencies. The triage system was fundamentally flawed. Patients were being prioritized based on arrival time rather than medical severity. The supply inventory was disorganized, leading to wasted time searching for basic equipment. Most critically, there was no clear chain of command during crisis situations. When Dr. Rothwell became overwhelmed, the entire emergency response system broke down. Elena had seen similar problems in field hospitals during wartime, but at least there they had the excuse of operating under combat conditions with limited resources. Riverside Memorial had access to modern equipment and supplies. They simply didn't have the systems in place to use them effectively. As she moved from patient to patient, Elena found herself mentally cataloging solutions. The triage system could be restructured using a modified version of the battlefield medical priority system she had helped develop. The supply management could be streamlined using logistics protocols from military field operations. The communication breakdown could be solved by implementing a clear command structure, similar to what she had used in combat medical units. But Elena kept these observations to herself. Her role here was to help individual patients, not to redesign the hospital's entire operational structure. She was supposed to be a former nursing student, not a military medical expert with years of experience in crisis management. Around 1:30 a.m., Elena was checking on Mrs. Patterson, who had returned to the emergency room with worsening abdominal pain, when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "The new administrator starts tomorrow," Dr. Rothwell was saying to Janet Morrison, who had stayed late to brief the night shift. "Dr. Harrison Blackthorne. I heard he's implementing some major changes to hospital policies." "What kind of changes?" Janet asked, sounding worried. "Stricter credentialing requirements for all staff, including volunteers. Background checks, verification of medical training, formal approval processes. He's apparently coming from Johns Hopkins, and he wants to run this place like a major medical center." Elena's hands remained steady as she adjusted Mrs. Patterson's fore, but her mind was racing. Enhanced background checks would be problematic for someone living under a military cover identity, while her false credentials were sophisticated enough to pass routine scrutiny. A determined administrator with resources could potentially uncover inconsistencies. "He's also talked about limiting volunteer activities," Dr. Rothwell continued. "Says too many hospitals get into legal trouble by allowing unqualified people to provide patient care. Apparently, he's planning to restrict volunteers to non-medical roles only." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she used to get before dangerous military missions when she knew that everything was about to change. She had found a fragile peace working at Riverside Memorial, but that peace was about to be threatened. Over the next few hours, Elena continued her rounds while processing this new information. She watched the staff work, noting how much they had come to rely on her assistance. Rebecca, the new nurse, had already turned to Elena 3 times for guidance on patient care procedures. Maria regularly consulted with Elena about medication, dosages, and treatment protocols. Even Dr. Rothwell had begun deferring to Elena's judgment on difficult cases. If Dr. Blackthorne succeeded in restricting volunteer activities, it wouldn't just affect Elena, it would cripple the emergency ward's ability to function during night shifts. The hospital was already understaffed, and removing Elena's assistance would inevitably lead to longer wait times, missed diagnoses, and potentially preventable deaths. But Elena also understood Dr. Blackthorne's perspective from a legal and administrative standpoint. Hospitals that allowed unqualified volunteers to provide medical care were exposed to significant liability risks. Insurance companies and regulatory agencies were increasingly scrutinizing such arrangements. From a purely bureaucratic viewpoint, restricting volunteer activities made perfect sense. The irony was that Elena was actually overqualified for the work she was doing at Riverside Memorial. Her military medical training exceeded the credentials of most civilian emergency room doctors. But she couldn't reveal that training without compromising her cover identity and potentially ending her carefully negotiated medical leave arrangement with the Navy. As dawn approached and Elena prepared to end her shift, she made a decision that went against every instinct from her military training. Instead of developing a strategic response to the incoming threat, instead of preparing contingency plans or alternative approaches, she chose to do nothing. She would continue her volunteer work exactly as she had been doing, helping patients and supporting the overworked staff. If Dr. Blackthorne wanted to challenge her presence at the hospital, she would deal with that situation when it arose. But she wouldn't abandon the patients who needed her care, and she wouldn't give up the sense of purpose she had found in this work. Elena had survived 15 years of military service by being proactive, by anticipating threats and neutralizing them before they could materialize. But now, living as a civilian, she was learning a different kind of courage, the courage to remain vulnerable, to trust in the basic decency of others, and to continue serving even when that service might not be appreciated or protected. As she walked out of Riverside Memorial into the early morning sunshine, Elena had no way of knowing that her decision to remain passive would prove to be the most dangerous choice of her entire military career. Dr. Harrison Blackthorne arrived at Riverside Memorial Hospital at precisely 7 a.m. on a crisp Tuesday morning, 30 minutes before his official start time. His black BMW sedan pulled into the administrative parking space marked Chief Administrator, and he sat for a moment, surveying his new domain through the tinted windows. At 42 years old, Dr. Blackthorne was everything that Riverside Memorial wasn't: polished, prestigious, and uncompromising in his standards. His resume read like a medical administrator's dream: Harvard Medical School, residency at Massachusetts General, administrative fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and 5 years as Associate Chief of Staff at Baltimore Presbyterian, one of the most exclusive private hospitals on the East Coast. He stepped out of his BMW wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most of Riverside Memorial's nurses made in a month. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the asphalt as he walked toward the main entrance, his briefcase genuine leather, engraved with his initials swinging at his side. Everything about Dr. Blackthorne projected authority, success, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. The truth was that Dr. Blackthorne's arrival at Riverside Memorial wasn't entirely voluntary. 6 months earlier, he had been forced to resign from Baltimore Presbyterian following a scandal involving discriminatory hiring practices and patient care policies that favored wealthy clients over emergency cases. The resignation had been quietly negotiated to avoid negative publicity, but word had spread through the medical community's exclusive networks. Riverside Memorial, desperate for credentialed leadership after their previous administrator had retired, suddenly had offered Dr. Blackthorne a position that came with significant autonomy and the promise of a substantial budget increase. For Dr. Blackthorne, it was a chance to rebuild his reputation while implementing the strict operational standards that he believed separated elite medical institutions from ordinary community hospitals. His plan was simple: transform Riverside Memorial into a model of medical efficiency and professional excellence. This would require eliminating the casual, small-town atmosphere that currently characterized the hospital and replacing it with the rigorous protocols and hierarchical structures he had learned at prestigious institutions. Dr. Blackthorne's first stop was the administrative offices, where he spent an hour reviewing personnel files and operational reports. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about small-town medical facilities. The staff was undertrained, the protocols were inconsistent, and the quality control measures were virtually non-existent. Most disturbing of all was the hospital's reliance on volunteer workers who had no formal medical credentials. According to the records, volunteers were regularly performing tasks that should be restricted to licensed medical professionals. They were taking vital signs, administering basic patient care, and even providing medical advice, all without proper oversight or liability protection. At 9:30 a.m., Dr. Blackthorne called his first staff meeting. The conference room was packed with nurses, technicians, and department heads who had heard rumors about the new administrator's reputation for dramatic changes. Janet Morrison sat in the front row, her hands folded nervously in her lap. Dr. Rothwell slouched in a corner chair, looking like he wished he could be anywhere else. "Good morning," Dr. Blackthorne began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I'm Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, and as of today, I'm implementing comprehensive reforms to bring this hospital into compliance with modern medical standards." He clicked through a PowerPoint presentation that outlined his vision for Riverside Memorial's transformation. Professional dress codes would be strictly enforced. All patient care protocols would be standardized according to best practices from major medical centers. Most importantly, all hospital personnel would be required to meet specific credentialing requirements within 30 days or face immediate termination. "This includes volunteers," Dr. Blackthorne continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I've reviewed the current volunteer program, and I'm frankly shocked by the lack of oversight. Effective immediately, all volunteers will be restricted to non-medical activities only, no exceptions." Janet Morrison raised her hand tentatively. Dr. Blackthorne, our night shift volunteers provide essential patient care support. Without them, we don't have adequate staffing then we'll hire additional qualified staff, Dr. Blackthorne interrupted. I will not oversee a facility where unqualified individuals are providing medical care to vulnerable patients. The liability exposure alone is unacceptable. Dr. Rothwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. With respect, sir, our volunteers are carefully supervised, and many of them have medical backgrounds. Do they have current medical licenses? Dr. Blackthorne asked sharply. Do they carry malpractice insurance? Are they certified in current medical protocols? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then they have no business touching patients in my hospital. The room fell silent. Several nurses exchanged worried glances, thinking immediately of Elena and the invaluable assistance she provided during the challenging night shifts. Dr. Blackthorne continued his presentation, outlining new policies for everything from patient intake procedures to staff break schedules. His vision was comprehensive and, admittedly, professionally sound. But it was also completely divorced from the reality of how Riverside Memorial actually functioned. I want to be absolutely clear about my expectations, Dr. Blackthorne said as he concluded his presentation. This hospital will operate according to the highest professional standards. We will not cut corners, we will not make exceptions, and we will not tolerate the kind of casual approach to medical care that has apparently been the norm here. He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final message. I understand that change can be difficult, especially in a close-knit community like this. But I want everyone to understand that maintaining the status quo is not an option. Either we elevate our standards to meet professional requirements, or we risk losing our accreditation, our funding, and ultimately, our ability to serve this community at all. After the meeting, Dr. Blackthorne returned to his office and began reviewing individual personnel files in detail. He was particularly interested in the volunteer records, which he found to be frustratingly incomplete. Most concerning was a volunteer named Elena Vasquez, who according to the logs had been providing significant patient care assistance for 3 months, without any documented medical credentials. Dr. Blackthorne made a note to investigate this Elena Vasquez immediately. In his experience, people who inserted themselves into medical situations without proper authority were usually either delusional about their abilities or deliberately trying to circumvent professional requirements for questionable reasons. He had built his career on eliminating exactly these kinds of irregularities from medical institutions. Elena Vasquez, whoever she was, would be the first example he made of his new standards at Riverside Memorial Hospital. At 2 p.m., Dr. Blackthorne instructed his secretary to schedule a meeting with all current volunteers for the following morning. He wanted to personally interview each of them and make his expectations crystal clear. Those who couldn't meet his requirements would be immediately dismissed. As he prepared for his first day of patient rounds, Dr. Blackthorne felt the familiar satisfaction that came with imposing order on chaos. Within weeks, Riverside Memorial would be operating like the professional medical facility it should have been all along. He had no idea that his crusade for professional standards was about to collide with a situation far more complex than anything his prestigious medical education had prepared him to handle. Elena arrived at Riverside Memorial that evening completely unaware of the storm that was about to engulf her carefully constructed civilian life. She had spent the day visiting her father at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, where she found him having one of his clearer days. They had talked about her mother's garden, his memories of teaching high school mathematics, and his pride in Elena's decision to help people, though he still believed she was studying to become a nurse rather than serving as a decorated military medical officer. The conversation with her father had reinforced Elena's sense of purpose. He had always taught her that the most important thing in life was to use whatever talents you had to make the world a little better. Tonight, as she walked through the employee entrance of Riverside Memorial, Elena felt that familiar sense of peace that came with knowing she was exactly where she needed to be. Jim Hendricks waved her through security with his usual friendly greeting, but Elena noticed something different in his expression, a kind of sympathetic concern that hadn't been there before. "Evening, Elena," he said quietly. "Just so you know, there's a new administrator making some changes around here. Might want to keep a low profile tonight." Elena thanked him and signed the volunteer log, though Jim's warning left her with an uneasy feeling. As she made her way toward the emergency ward, she could sense tension in the hospital's atmosphere. Staff members moved with the kind of nervous energy that usually accompanied major institutional changes. The emergency ward was busier than usual for a Wednesday night. Elena counted 22 patients in the waiting area, and the triage nurse looked overwhelmed. Maria Santos spotted Elena immediately and hurried over with obvious relief. "Elena, thank God you're here. We've had 3 ambulances in the last hour, and Rebecca called in sick. Dr. Rothwell is barely keeping up. And the new administrator has been prowling around all day, asking questions about our procedures." Elena nodded and began her usual routine, checking on patients and providing assistance wherever needed. But tonight, she noticed several staff members watching her with worried expressions, as if they knew something she didn't. Around 10:30 p.m., Elena was helping an elderly man named George Hensley who had come in with severe chest pain. George was 83 years old, lived alone, and was clearly frightened by the bustling emergency room environment. Elena took his vital signs, noting slightly elevated blood pressure and an irregular heartbeat that suggested atrial fibrillation concerning, but not immediately life-threatening. "The pain started about 2 hours ago," George told her, gripping her hand tightly. "Right here in my chest, and it goes down my arm sometimes. I didn't want to bother anyone, but my neighbor Mrs. Chun insisted I come in." Elena listened to his heart with her stethoscope, recognizing the distinctive irregular rhythm of atrial fibrillation. His symptoms suggested possible angina rather than an acute heart attack, but given his age and the duration of his symptoms, he needed immediate cardiac evaluation. "George, you did the right thing coming in," Elena said gently. "I'm going to make sure the doctor sees you right away, and we're going to get you feeling better." As Elena moved toward the nurse's station to alert Dr. Rothwell about George's condition, she suddenly found her path blocked by a tall man in an expensive suit. Dr. Harrison Blackthorne stood directly in front of her, his arms crossed and his expression radiating cold authority. "Excuse me," Dr. Blackthorne said, his voice carrying across the emergency ward loud enough for other patients and staff to hear. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" Elena felt every eye in the emergency room turn toward her. Patients stopped their conversations. Nurses paused in their work, and even Dr. Rothwell looked up from his charts with obvious concern. "Yes, I am," Elena replied calmly, though her military training immediately kicked in, assessing Dr. Blackthorne as a potential threat and evaluating possible responses to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "I'm Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, the new chief administrator of this hospital," he announced, speaking loudly enough to ensure that everyone within 20 feet could hear every word. "I've been reviewing our volunteer records, and I have some serious concerns about your activities here." Elena maintained her composure, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dr. Blackthorne. I'm here as a volunteer to help however I can." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Blackthorne said, his voice growing louder and more condescending. "According to my observations and the reports I've received, you've been performing medical procedures that are far beyond the scope of volunteer activities. You've been taking vital signs, administering patient care, and even providing medical advice." The emergency room had fallen completely silent now. George Hensley, still clutching his chest in pain, watched the confrontation with confusion and Growing concern. Other patients shifted uncomfortably in their beds and chairs, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Dr. Blackthorne," Elena said carefully, "I only help with basic patient care under the supervision of the nursing staff." "Don't interrupt me," Dr. Blackthorne snapped, his professional demeanor giving way to barely controlled anger. "I've spent the day reviewing your volunteer application, and it's frankly inadequate. You list some community college coursework, but no formal medical training, no certifications, no professional references. Yet you've somehow convinced the staff here to allow you to act like a medical professional." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest that she always experienced when forced to remain passive in the face of injustice. Every instinct from her military training told her to defend herself, to assert her actual qualifications, to demand the respect that her years of service had earned. But she couldn't do any of those things without compromising her cover identity and potentially ending her medical leave arrangement with the Navy. "I understand your concerns," Elena said quietly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No. I think this conversation needs to happen publicly," Dr. Blackthorne declared, now clearly enjoying the spectacle he was creating. "I want everyone here to understand that this hospital operates according to professional standards, not the casual arrangements that apparently existed before my arrival." He turned to address the nursing staff, who were watching the confrontation with obvious distress. "This is exactly the kind of situation that creates liability exposure for our institution. Unqualified individuals providing medical care to vulnerable patients. It's unprofessional, it's dangerous, and it ends tonight." Maria Santos stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly. "Dr. Blackthorne, Elena has been invaluable to our night shift operations. She's helped save lives, and she always works under proper supervision." "Nurse Santos," Dr. Blackthorne interrupted sharply, "are you willing to stake your nursing license on the medical decisions made by someone with no formal training? Because that's exactly what you're doing every time you allow this volunteer to provide patient care." Elena watched Maria's face crumble as the implications of Dr. Blackthorne's words sank in. The nurse had been put in an impossible position, forced to choose between defending Elena and protecting her own professional standing. The humiliation was complete and devastating. But not just for Elena. George Hensley continued to clutch his chest pain forgotten as he watched a kind woman who had been trying to help him get publicly destroyed by a man in an expensive suit. Other patients looked away in embarrassment, sensing that they were witnessing something cruel and unnecessary. But Dr. Blackthorne wasn't finished. He had one more humiliation to deliver, one that would ensure that Elena Vasquez never again set foot in his hospital. Dr. Blackthorne surveyed the silent emergency room with obvious satisfaction, relishing the power he wielded over the situation. Elena stood motionless, her face carefully composed despite the public attack on her character and competence. But Dr. Blackthorne wasn't finished. He had orchestrated this confrontation to send a message that would resonate throughout the entire hospital. And Elena's quiet dignity only seemed to fuel his determination to break her completely. "Let me be very specific about what I've observed," Dr. Blackthorne continued, his voice carrying the tone of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "Yesterday evening, according to the incident reports, you diagnosed a patient with what you called an apnea, a heart attack. You ordered nursing staff to call the cardiac team and prepare emergency interventions." Elena felt her stomach drop. The incident with Tony DeLuca had been properly documented in medical records, but she hadn't realized that her actions would be scrutinized by someone looking for reasons to discredit her. "Who gave you the authority to make medical diagnoses?" Dr. Blackthorne demanded. "What medical degree grants you the expertise to recognize cardiac emergencies? What malpractice insurance covers your medical decisions?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Elena knew that everything she had done to help Tony had been medically appropriate and potentially life-saving, but she couldn't explain her diagnostic expertise without revealing her true identity. "I simply observed symptoms that seemed concerning and suggested that medical staff evaluate the patient more closely," Elena said carefully. "The actual diagnosis was made by the cardiac team. That's not what the nursing staff reported, Doctor." Blackthorne shot back, pulling out a folder filled with documentation. "According to these records, you specifically stated that the patient was experiencing Saint elevation and gave detailed instructions about emergency cardiac protocols. That level of specificity suggests medical training that you failed to disclose." "Doctor." Rothwell stepped forward nervously. "Dr. Blackthorne, perhaps we could discuss this in private." The patient in question made a full recovery, and Elena's observations were, "Dr. Rothwell," Dr. Blackthorne interrupted with icy authority. "Are you suggesting that positive outcomes justify unauthorized medical practice? Because that attitude represents exactly the kind of negligent thinking that exposes this hospital to massive liability." Elena watched Dr. Rothwell's face pale as he realized he had walked into a trap. The physician was being forced to choose between defending Elena and protecting his own position at the hospital. "Furthermore," Dr. Blackthorne continued, turning his attention back to Elena, "I've discovered that you've been accessing patient medical records, reviewing treatment plans, and making recommendations about medication dosages. These activities require specific licensing and authorization that you clearly don't possess." This accusation was more serious, and Elena knew it. She had indeed reviewed patient charts to better understand their conditions and provide appropriate care, but she had always done so in collaboration with nursing staff and with their explicit permission. "I've only looked at information that was shared with me by licensed medical staff," Elena replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've never accessed any records independently." "Semantics," Dr. Blackthorne declared dismissively. "The point is that you've been functioning as an unlicensed medical practitioner in this facility, making decisions that could have resulted in patient harm or death. The fact that you've been fortunate enough to avoid negative outcomes doesn't excuse the fundamental violation of medical ethics and hospital policy." By now, a small crowd had gathered. Night shift staff from other departments had heard the commotion and drifted toward the emergency ward. Maintenance workers paused there, cleaning routines to listen. Even some patients from other areas of the hospital had come to see what was happening. Elena realized that Dr. Blackthorne had deliberately chosen this public setting to maximize the humiliation. This wasn't just about enforcing hospital policies, it was about making an example that would demonstrate his authority and discourage anyone else from challenging his new regime. "But here's what I find most disturbing," Dr. Blackthorne said, his voice rising to ensure that every person in the expanding crowd could hear clearly. "You've been deceiving the staff of this hospital for months. You've allowed them to believe that you have medical expertise while concealing your lack of formal qualifications. That's not just unprofessional, it's fraudulent." The word fraudulent hit Elena like a physical blow. In her military career, integrity had been everything. The suggestion that she had deliberately deceived people who trusted her was more painful than any criticism of her medical skills. "I never claimed to have qualifications I don't possess," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I only tried to help." "Help?" Dr. Blackthorne repeated with obvious scorn. "You call it helping when you manipulate vulnerable people into trusting your unauthorized medical advice? You call it helping when you put patients at risk by overstepping your qualifications? You call it helping when you expose this hospital to potential lawsuits that could destroy our ability to serve this community?" George Hensley, still waiting for treatment for his chest pain, raised a shaky hand from his bed. "Excuse me, doctor, but Elena was trying to help me when you interrupted her. Could someone please—" "Sir," Dr. Blackthorne snapped at the elderly patient, You're experiencing exactly the kind of confusion that makes unqualified volunteers so dangerous. This woman has no medical training, no professional oversight, and no legal authority to provide you with any kind of medical care whatsoever. The cruelty of dismissing a patient's pain while publicly humiliating someone who had been trying to help was so stark that several nurses gasped audibly. Maria Santos moved toward George's bed, but Dr. Blackthorne held up a hand to stop her. "Actually, this provides a perfect teaching moment," Dr. Blackthorne announced. "Mr. Hensley, whatever this volunteer told you about your condition is medically meaningless. She has no more qualification to assess your symptoms than a janitor or a cafeteria worker. Any advice she gave you should be completely disregarded." Elena felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured enemy fire, biological weapons exposure, and life-threatening medical emergencies without breaking down. She wouldn't give Dr. Blackthorne the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Now," Dr. Blackthorne said, turning back to Elena with finality in his voice, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to leave this hospital voluntarily and with whatever dignity you have remaining. Because if you force me to call security and have you escorted out, I'll also be filing formal complaints with the state medical board and potentially pursuing criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license." The threat was clear and devastating. Elena understood that Dr. Blackthorne held all the power in this situation. She could either accept this public humiliation and leave quietly, or face legal consequences that could potentially compromise her military status and destroy the carefully constructed cover identity that the Department of Defense had created for her. But as Elena looked around the emergency room at the faces of staff members and patients who had come to depend on her care, she realized that the personal cost of leaving quietly might be even higher than the risk of fighting back. Elena stood frozen in the center of the emergency room, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes watching her public destruction. Dr. Blackthorne's ultimatum hung in the air like a death sentence: leave voluntarily or face criminal charges that could destroy everything she had worked to protect. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she considered simply walking away, accepting the humiliation, and disappearing back into the anonymous civilian life she had been trying to build. But then George Hensley cried out in pain. The elderly man's chest pain had worsened during the confrontation, his breathing becoming more labored as stress and anxiety compounded his cardiac condition. His face had turned a concerning shade of gray, and he was pressing both hands against his chest while struggling to catch his breath. "Please," George gasped, looking desperately around the room. "Someone help me. Elena's medical training screamed at her to respond. Every instinct developed over 15 years of emergency medicine demanded that she move immediately to assess and treat a patient in obvious distress. But Dr. Blackthorne stood directly between her and George's bed. His arms crossed in a clear message that any attempt to help would be seen as defiance of his authority. "Nurse Santos," Dr. Blackthorne called out without taking his eyes off Elena, "please tend to Mr. Hensley, and remember no unauthorized personnel are to be involved in his care." Maria Santos hurried toward George's bed, but Elena could see the nurse's hands shaking as she approached. Maria was competent and caring, but she lacked the experience to handle complex cardiac emergencies. Elena watched in growing horror as Maria fumbled with the blood pressure cuff, her nervousness making her movements clumsy and inefficient. "His systolic is dropping," Maria called out, her voice tight with worry. "And his heart rate is becoming more irregular." Dr. Rothwell approached George's bed, but Elena could see immediately that he was overwhelmed. The physician's hands trembled as he tried to assess the patient's condition, and his diagnostic approach was slow and uncertain. Elena recognized the signs of a doctor who was out of his depth, afraid to make a mistake that might draw more criticism from the new administrator. "Should I call the cardiac team?" Maria asked Dr. Rothwell. Let me just ... Dr. Rothwell stammered, clearly uncertain about the proper protocol under Dr. Blackthorn's watchful gaze. Elena watched this scene unfold with mounting desperation. She could see exactly what George needed: immediate cardiac monitoring, sublingual nitroglycerin to relieve the chest pain, and preparation for potential emergency intervention if his condition deteriorated further. The treatment was straightforward for someone with her level of training, but the staff was paralyzed by fear of making the wrong decision in front of Dr. Blackthorn. George's breathing became more labored, and Elena saw his lips beginning to show a bluish tint, a sign of oxygen deprivation that indicated his condition was becoming critical. "Dr. Rothwell," Elena said quietly, trying to keep her voice calm despite her growing panic, "I think Mr. Hensley might benefit from supplemental oxygen and cardiac monitoring. Did I not make myself clear?" Dr. Blackthorn exploded, whirling to face Elena with fury in his eyes. "You have no authority to make medical suggestions in this hospital. Your volunteer privileges are revoked as of this moment. Security." The word security echoed through the emergency room like a gunshot. Elena felt everything around her slowing down as the full implications of the moment crystallized. George Hensley was deteriorating rapidly. The medical staff was too intimidated to act decisively, and she was about to be forcibly removed from the hospital. But then something else happened that would change everything. From across the emergency room, a voice called out with unmistakable authority, "What the hell is going on here?" Everyone turned to see a tall woman in navy dress whites striding through the emergency room entrance. Commander Patricia Reyes, Elena's former colleague and current liaison with the Department of Defense, had arrived at Riverside Memorial Hospital for what was supposed to be a routine check-in with Elena as part of her medical leave monitoring. Commander Reyes had been briefed on Elena's cover identity and was supposed to maintain the fiction that she was simply a family friend visiting from out of town. But the scene she walked into, Elena being publicly humiliated while a patient suffered in the background, was so far beyond acceptable that military protocol became secondary to immediate human concern. "Commander," Elena whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. The appearance of anyone connected to her military identity was exactly the kind of exposure that could destroy her carefully negotiated leave arrangement. Dr. Blackthorn, unaware of the significance of the newcomer, turned his attention to Commander Reyes with obvious irritation. "Ma'am, this is a private hospital matter. I'm going to have to ask you to." "I'm Commander Patricia Reyes, United States Navy," Commander Reyes said, her voice cutting through Dr. Blackthorn's words like a blade. "And that woman you're humiliating is under my direct supervision." The emergency room fell into complete silence. Elena felt her world tilting off its axis as her carefully constructed civilian identity began to crumble in real time. Dr. Blackthorn's face showed confusion and growing alarm as he tried to process what he was hearing. "I don't understand," Dr. Blackthorn said slowly. "This woman is a volunteer with no medical training. This woman..." Commander Reyes interrupted, her voice rising with barely controlled anger, "is Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Elena Vasquez Restrepo, one of the most decorated combat medical officers in the United States Navy. She has more medical training and experience than half the doctors in this hospital combined." Elena closed her eyes, knowing that her cover was blown and her peaceful civilian existence was over. But even as her personal world collapsed, she could hear George Hensley's labored breathing growing more desperate, and she knew that the breaking point had finally arrived. The moment when everything she had been trying to protect would have to be sacrificed to save a single human life. Commander Reyes stepped closer to Dr. Blackthorn, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent emergency room. "And if that patient dies while you're playing your power games with one of the finest military physicians I've ever served with, I will personally ensure that this incident reaches the desk of every medical review board, every hospital accreditation agency, and every news outlet in the country." The gauntlet had been thrown. Elena's secret was out. Dr. Blackthorne's authority was being challenged by federal military officers, and George Hensley was still fighting for his life in the background. Everything was about to change. The silence in the emergency room stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Elena stood at the epicenter of a crisis that had spiraled far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first started volunteering at Riverside Memorial. Her cover identity lay in ruins. A Navy commander was facing off against the hospital administrator, and George Hensley's increasingly labored breathing served as a tragic soundtrack to the unfolding confrontation. Dr. Blackthorne's face cycled through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a calculating look that suggested he was trying to determine how this revelation might affect his position. Elena could practically see the gears turning in his mind as he processed the implications of having publicly humiliated a decorated military officer. "I don't care what rank she holds," Dr. Blackthorne said finally, his voice lacking the confident authority it had carried moments earlier. "Military credentials don't authorize civilian medical practice. This is still my hospital, and hospital policies still apply to everyone within these walls." Commander Reyes stepped closer to Dr. Blackthorne, her military bearing making her appear taller and more imposing despite being roughly the same height. "Doctor, you have approximately 30 seconds to decide whether you want this incident to be resolved quietly or whether you prefer to explain to your board of directors why you prevented a Navy medical officer from saving a patient's life." Elena watched this confrontation with growing desperation, acutely aware that while they argued about authority and jurisdiction, George Hensley was deteriorating rapidly. His lips were now distinctly blue, his breathing had become shallow and irregular, and she could see from across the room that his hands were showing the early signs of peripheral cyanosis. "He needs immediate intervention," Elena said urgently, her voice cutting through the argument between Commander Reyes and Dr. Blackthorne. "His oxygen saturation is dropping, and his cardiac rhythm is becoming increasingly unstable." Dr. Rothwell looked up from George's bedside, his face pale with anxiety. "I've ordered an EKG, but the technician is with another patient, and I'm not sure about the best approach for. There's no time for an EKG." Elena interrupted, her military training taking over as the medical emergency superseded all other considerations. "He's showing classic signs of acute cardiac decompensation. He needs oxygen, sublingual nitroglycerin, and immediate preparation for emergency cardiac intervention. You cannot give medical orders in this hospital," Dr. Blackthorne shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "I don't care what military rank you hold. You have no civilian medical license, no hospital privileges, and no authority to treat patients in this facility." Elena felt something snap inside her chest, not physically, but emotionally. For months, she had been living in a kind of professional purgatory, unable to use her full medical expertise because of her cover identity, watching suboptimal patient care because she couldn't reveal her true qualifications. She had accepted this limitation as the price of maintaining her carefully negotiated leave arrangement with the Navy. But now, watching George Hensley struggle for breath while bureaucratic arguments delayed his care, Elena realized that some things were more important than maintaining cover identities or protecting institutional arrangements. "You're right," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the emergency room stop talking and turn to look at her. "I don't have civilian medical privileges at this hospital." She walked toward George's bed, ignoring Dr. Blackthorne's sputtered protests and Commander Reyes's worried expression. "But I have something more important than hospital privileges," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have 15 years of experience treating patients under conditions that would paralyze most civilian medical staff. I have training in emergency procedures that aren't taught in civilian medical schools. And I have a moral obligation that supersedes every bureaucratic regulation you can cite. Elena reached George's bedside and immediately began her assessment, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency that had saved countless lives in combat zones around the world. She checked his pulse, assessed his breathing, and evaluated his color and responsiveness with the kind of systematic thoroughness that came from years of emergency medicine practice. "Maria," Elena called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command in life or death situations. "I need high-flow oxygen, sublingual nitroglycerin if we have it, and immediate cardiac monitoring. Rebecca, call the cardiac team and tell them we have a patient in acute decompensation who may need emergency intervention." The nurses responded immediately, their movements becoming more confident and efficient under Elena's clear direction. For the first time since Dr. Blackthorne's arrival, the emergency room staff was functioning like a coordinated medical team, rather than a group of individuals paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. "This is completely unacceptable," Dr. Blackthorne protested, but his voice seemed smaller now, less authoritative in the face of Elena's obvious medical competence. "Dr. Blackthorne," Commander Riaz said calmly, "I strongly suggest that you step back and allow Dr. Vasquez to provide the medical care that this patient desperately needs. Because if you continue to interfere with emergency medical treatment, I will personally ensure that this incident is investigated by every relevant authority, including the Inspector General's office." Elena barely heard the argument continuing. Behind her, her entire focus had narrowed to George Hensley and the immediate steps needed to stabilize his condition. As the oxygen mask was placed over his face and his color began to improve slightly, Elena felt the familiar sense of purpose that had driven her through 15 years of military medical service. This was why she had become a doctor, not for the recognition or the authority, but for moments like this when her skills and knowledge could mean the difference between life and death for another human being. "George," Elena said gently, taking his hand as his breathing began to stabilize, "you're going to be okay. The cardiac team is on their way, and we're going to take excellent care of you." George squeezed her hand weakly, his eyes showing recognition and gratitude despite his medical distress. Elena looked up from the patient to see every staff member in the emergency room watching her with a mixture of awe and understanding. They were finally seeing her as she truly was not a volunteer with questionable qualifications, but a highly trained medical professional whose expertise far exceeded what they had imagined possible. The decision had been made. Elena's cover identity was destroyed. Her carefully constructed civilian life was over, but she had chosen to save a life rather than protect her anonymity. Now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. The cardiac team arrived within minutes of Elena's call, their urgent footsteps echoing through the corridors as they rushed toward the emergency ward. Dr. Michael Chun, Riverside Memorial's lead cardiologist, burst through the doors with his team of specialists, expecting to find the usual chaos that accompanied cardiac emergencies in the understaffed night shift. Instead, he found something unprecedented, a patient who was stable, properly monitored, and receiving optimal pre-intervention care under the direction of someone he didn't recognize. "Who's the attending physician here?" Dr. Chun asked, looking around the emergency room with confusion. He had worked with Dr. Rothwell before and knew that cardiac emergencies were not the man's strong suit. Yet the patient care he was witnessing suggested a level of expertise that exceeded what he would have expected. "Dr. Chun," Elena said, stepping forward with the quiet confidence that had characterized her military service. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I've stabilized Mr. Hensley's condition, but he's going to need immediate cardiac catheterization to address what appears to be an acute coronary syndrome." Dr. Chun studied Elena with growing interest. Her assessment was concise, accurate, and delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested extensive emergency medicine experience. Her positioning of the patient, her choice of interventions, and her preparation for the cardiac team's arrival all indicated someone with sophisticated medical training. "I'm sorry, Dr. Vasquez," Dr. Chun said politely, "but I don't believe we've met. Are you new to Riverside Memorial's medical staff?" Before Elena could respond, Dr. Blackthorne inserted himself into the conversation with obvious agitation. "Dr. Chun, this woman is not a member of our medical staff. She's a volunteer who has been providing unauthorized medical care, and I've already ordered her removal from the hospital." Dr. Chun looked from Dr. Blackthorne to Elena with growing confusion. "I'm sorry, but if she's not a physician, how was she able to provide this level of cardiac care? Mr. Hensley's condition is textbook perfect for emergency intervention. Someone with extensive training clearly managed his pre-hospital stabilization." "That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to Dr. Blackthorne," Commander Reyes interjected, stepping forward with an expression that suggested her patience with the hospital administrator had reached its limit. "Dr. Vasquez is a lieutenant colonel in the United States Navy Medical Corps with 15 years of combat medicine experience." The words hung in the air like a revelation that changed everything. Dr. Chun's eyebrows rose with surprise and obvious respect, while other members of the cardiac team exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation they had walked into. "Lieutenant Colonel?" Dr. Chun repeated, his voice carrying a new note of deference. "Ma'am, if you're military medical, then you outrank most of the physicians in this hospital in terms of emergency medicine experience." But before Elena could respond, the emergency room doors burst open again, and this time the entrance was even more dramatic than the cardiac team's arrival. Admiral Robert Sterling, United States Navy, strode into Riverside Memorial Hospital wearing his full dress uniform complete with ribbons, medals, and insignia that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present. At 62 years old, Admiral Sterling was an imposing figure whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere of any room he entered. Admiral Sterling was not supposed to be at Riverside Memorial Hospital. He was not supposed to know Elena's location, her cover identity, or her current assignment status. But 20 minutes earlier, he had received an emergency call from Commander Reyes reporting that a classified Navy medical officer was being threatened with criminal charges by a civilian hospital administrator. The Admiral had been in the middle of a dinner meeting with Congressional Defense Committee members when the call came through. He had excused himself from the dinner, ordered his driver to take him immediately to Riverside Memorial Hospital, and spent the 20-minute drive reviewing Elena's classified service record on his secure tablet. What he had read during that drive had filled him with a combination of pride and fury that was now evident in his bearing as he surveyed the emergency room scene. "Where is Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez?" Admiral Sterling asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room automatically straighten their posture. Elena stepped forward, her military training kicking in as she recognized the presence of a superior officer. "Admiral Sterling, sir." "I'm here." Admiral Sterling looked at Elena for a long moment, taking in her civilian clothes, her exhausted appearance, and the medical equipment surrounding George Hensley's bed. Then he turned his attention to Dr. Blackthorne, who was staring at the Admiral with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that the situation had escalated far beyond his control. "Dr. Blackthorne, I presume?" Admiral Sterling said, his voice carefully neutral but carrying an undertone that suggested dangerous possibilities. "I'm Admiral Robert Sterling, Surgeon General of the United States Navy. I understand you've been having some concerns about Dr. Vasquez's medical qualifications." Dr. Blackthorne's face had gone completely pale. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words adequate to the situation he found himself in. "Before we continue this conversation," Admiral Sterling said, removing a folder from his briefcase, "I think it would be appropriate for everyone present to understand exactly who Dr. Vasquez is and what she has accomplished in service to her country." The Admiral opened the folder and began to read, his voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent emergency room. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Elena Catherine Vasquez Restrepo, United States Navy Medical Corps, 15 years of active duty service. Combat Medical Officer of the Year, 2019, 2021, and 2023. Silver Star for Valor in Medical Operations under Enemy Fire. Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Life-Saving Actions during Chemical Weapons Attack in Classified Location. Developer of Advanced Tactical Combat Medicine Protocols currently used by Special Operations Forces worldwide. With each credential, Elena watched Dr. Blackthorne's expression change from confusion to growing alarm to what appeared to be genuine horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Author of 17 peer-reviewed papers on emergency medicine and trauma surgery, Admiral Sterling continued. Holder of 12 military medical certifications that exceed civilian board certifications. Consultant to the Department of Defense on battlefield medical protocols and biological warfare response. The Admiral closed the folder and looked directly at Dr. Blackthorne with an expression that could have frozen water. "In summary, Dr. Blackthorne, you have just publicly humiliated and threatened with criminal charges one of the most decorated and accomplished military medical officers in the United States Navy, an officer who was performing volunteer medical service during her authorized medical leave." The confrontation that Elena had been dreading was about to begin, but now she wouldn't be facing it alone. Admiral Sterling stepped closer to Dr. Blackthorne, who now appeared to be experiencing something resembling shock as the full implications of the situation became clear. The emergency room had fallen into complete silence except for the steady beeping of George Hensley's heart monitor, a sound that served as a reminder of the life that Elena's intervention had helped save. Dr. Blackthorne, Admiral Sterling, continued, his voice maintaining that carefully controlled tone that military officers used when they were exercising tremendous restraint. "I'm curious about something. When you decided to publicly humiliate Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, did you bother to conduct any actual investigation into her background?" Dr. Blackthorne opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently realizing that any answer he gave would only make his situation worse. "Because if you had conducted even the most basic background check," Admiral Sterling said, pulling out his secure tablet, "you would have discovered that Dr. Vasquez has been operating under a classified cover identity, authorized at the highest levels of the Department of Defense." Elena felt her stomach drop. She had known that her cover would eventually be compromised, but she hadn't expected the Admiral to reveal the classified nature of her civilian assignment in such a public setting. "Her presence at this hospital," Admiral Sterling continued, "has been part of an authorized medical leave arrangement that was personally approved by the Secretary of Defense. Her volunteer activities were not only legitimate, they were being monitored and evaluated as part of her transition back to active duty status." The revelation hit the emergency room like a physical force. Elena watched as staff members who had worked with her for months suddenly understood that they had been unwitting participants in a classified military operation. Dr. Chun looked fascinated. Maria Santos appeared stunned, and even Dr. Rothwell seemed to be processing the implications with growing amazement. "Furthermore," Admiral Sterling said, turning his tablet to display what appeared to be official government documentation, "Dr. Vasquez's medical credentials include certifications that don't exist in civilian medicine. She is one of only 12 people worldwide certified in advanced biological warfare medical response. She has personally developed trauma surgery techniques that are classified at the top secret level. Her expertise in chemical weapons treatment is considered essential to national security. Elena realized that Admiral Sterling was not just offending her, he was systematically destroying any credibility that Dr. Blackthorne might retain after this incident. The Admiral was ensuring that everyone present understood not just Elena's qualifications, but the extraordinary nature of those qualifications. "Dr. Blackthorne," Admiral Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "you didn't just attack a volunteer nurse. You didn't just humiliate a military officer. You interfered with a classified Department of Defense operation and threatened criminal charges against an officer whose medical expertise is considered vital to national security." Dr. Blackthorne's face had progressed from pale to a sickly gray color that reminded Elena of patients in shock. She almost felt sorry for him, but not quite, given the cruelty he had displayed toward patients and staff. "Sir," Dr. Blackthorne finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper, "I had no way of knowing. Her volunteer application didn't indicate any of this information." "Of course it didn't," Admiral Sterling replied with obvious exasperation. "The entire point of a cover identity is that it doesn't reveal classified information. Did you seriously expect a covert military operation to announce itself on a hospital volunteer form?" Elena watched this exchange with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was grateful for Admiral Sterling's protection and vindication. On the other hand, she knew that this public revelation would end any possibility of returning to her quiet volunteer work at Riverside Memorial. Her peaceful civilian existence was being destroyed in order to save it. "But here's what I find most disturbing about this incident," Admiral Sterling said, his voice rising slightly as he addressed not just Dr. Blackthorne, but the entire room. "Dr. Vasquez has been providing volunteer medical services for 3 months. 3 months during which she helped save lives, improved patient care, and provided support to an understaffed emergency department." The Admiral gestured toward George Hensley, who was now stable and breathing comfortably with oxygen support. "Tonight, while you were busy humiliating her for lacking proper credentials, she was once again saving a life. Mr. Hensley would likely be dead right now if Dr. Vasquez hadn't been here to recognize his condition and provide immediate intervention." Dr. Chun stepped forward, his expression showing a mixture of professional admiration and growing anger. "Admiral Sterling, if I may, I've reviewed what Dr. Vasquez did for Mr. Hensley tonight, and her cardiac assessment and intervention were flawless. Her diagnostic accuracy and treatment protocols exceeded what I would expect from most emergency medicine specialists." "That's because she is not most emergency medicine specialists," Admiral Sterling replied. "Dr. Vasquez has performed emergency surgery under enemy fire. She has treated victims of chemical weapons attacks. She has saved lives in conditions that would incapacitate most civilian medical personnel." Elena watched as the staff members around her began to process this information. Maria Santos was staring at her with something approaching awe. Rebecca Foster looked like she was trying to reconcile the quiet volunteer she had known with the decorated military officer being described. Even Dr. Rothwell seemed to be experiencing a complete recalibration of his understanding of Elena's capabilities. "Dr. Blackthorne," Admiral Sterling said, turning his full attention back to the hospital administrator, "I want to be very clear about something. Dr. Vasquez has been nothing but professional, competent, and dedicated in her service to this hospital. She has asked for nothing, demanded no recognition, and has consistently gone above and beyond in her care for patients." The Admiral paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what Elena realized would be the final blow to Dr. Blackthorne's credibility. "In contrast, you have displayed the kind of arrogant incompetence that gives hospital administration a bad name. You have prioritized bureaucratic compliance over patient care. You have humiliated dedicated staff members. And you have demonstrated such poor judgment that you threatened criminal charges against one of the Navy's most valuable medical officers." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena looked around the emergency room at faces that reflected shock, admiration, anger, and embarrassment in various combinations. The revelation of her true identity had changed everything, and she knew that there would be no going back to the simple volunteer existence she had been living. But as she watched George Hensley breathing steadily with the help of the oxygen support she had provided, Elena realized that perhaps going back wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was moving forward, and Admiral Sterling was clearly preparing to ensure that her path forward would be very different from the quiet civilian life she had been trying to build. Elena stepped forward, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt the full weight of her military authority settling around her shoulders like an invisible uniform. For months, she had been Elena the volunteer, humble and deferential, careful not to overstep boundaries or draw attention to herself. But now, with her true identity revealed and Admiral Sterling's protection secured, she was Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Elena Vasquez Restrepo, and she had something to say. "Dr. Blackthorne," Elena said, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the emergency room focus their complete attention on her. "You asked me earlier about my medical qualifications. Since Admiral Sterling has now provided you with that information, I think it's appropriate for me to address some of the concerns you raised about my presence in this hospital." Dr. Blackthorne looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, but Elena wasn't finished with him yet. "You questioned my diagnostic capabilities when I identified Mr. DeLuca's heart attack yesterday evening. Let me explain to you exactly how I was able to make that diagnosis so quickly," Elena continued, her voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to a particularly slow student. "In 2019, while serving with Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, I treated 43 cardiac emergencies under active combat conditions. I performed emergency cardiac surgery in a bombed-out clinic with no electricity while enemy forces were literally shooting at the building. I developed a rapid cardiac assessment protocol that has since been adopted by military medical units worldwide." Elena moved closer to Dr. Blackthorne, who seemed to shrink with each step she took. "You questioned my knowledge of medication dosages and treatment protocols. During my deployment to Syria in 2021, I was the sole medical officer responsible for treating chemical weapons exposure in 47 civilians. I had to calculate medication dosages for patients whose ages ranged from 6 months to 90 years old, using medications that most civilian doctors have never heard of, while wearing full chemical protection gear that made normal medical procedures nearly impossible." The emergency room staff was watching this exchange with fascination. Elena could see Maria Santos nodding with obvious satisfaction, as if she had always suspected that Elena was far more qualified than she appeared. "You criticized my knowledge of cardiac protocols," Elena continued. "Last year, I spent 6 months at Walter Reed Army Medical Center developing new cardiac trauma procedures for battlefield injuries. The techniques I developed are now standard practice for military medical units, and they've been credited with saving hundreds of lives in combat zones." Elena paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her next point. "But here's what I think you really need to understand, Dr. Blackthorne. You didn't just attack my qualifications tonight. You attacked my integrity. You accused me of fraud, of deceiving the staff of this hospital, of putting patients at risk through incompetence." Elena's voice hardened, and for the first time, Dr. Blackthorne could hear the steel that had carried her through 15 years of military service. "I have spent my entire adult life in service to others. I have risked my life repeatedly to save people I had never met and would never see again. I have missed birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings because I was in some remote location, treating patients who had nowhere else to turn for medical care." Elena gestured toward the emergency room around them. "When I came to Riverside Memorial, I wasn't looking for recognition or authority. I was looking for a way to continue serving others while I recovered from a medical condition that I developed while treating victims of biological weapons. I wanted to use my skills to help people in a peaceful environment without the pressure of combat or the weight of military protocol. Elena turned to address the nursing staff, who had been watching this confrontation with obvious emotional investment. Maria, Rebecca, Janet, you welcomed me into your team. You trusted me with your patience. You allowed me to help during some of the most challenging nights this emergency department has faced. You never once questioned my motives or demanded credentials that I couldn't provide. Elena looked back at Dr. Blackthorne with an expression that mixed disappointment with determination. But you, Dr. Blackthorne, looked at my volunteer application and saw only what was missing. You didn't see 3 months of dedicated service. You didn't see patients whose lives were improved by my care. You didn't see staff members who were grateful for the support I provided during understaffed shifts. Elena's voice rose slightly, carrying clearly to every corner of the emergency room. You saw a woman in simple clothes with no fancy credentials, and you decided that she couldn't possibly have anything valuable to offer. You decided that appearances were more important than actions, that credentials were more important than competence, and that bureaucratic compliance was more important than patient care. Dr. Blackthorne tried to speak, but Elena wasn't finished. Tonight, while you were humiliating me for lacking proper authority, George Hensley was having a heart attack. While you were lecturing me about liability and professional standards, a human being was dying 15 feet away from us. And your response was to prevent me from helping him because I didn't have the right paperwork. Elena looked around the emergency room at the faces of staff members and patients who had witnessed the entire confrontation. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Dr. Blackthorne, you care more about protecting the hospital from liability than you care about protecting patients from preventable death. You care more about enforcing regulations than you care about the human lives that those regulations are supposed to protect. Elena turned to Admiral Sterling, who had been watching her delivery with obvious pride. Admiral, I want to make something clear. I don't regret volunteering at Riverside Memorial. I don't regret helping patients who needed care. And I don't regret breaking my cover tonight to save Mr. Hensley's life. If that compromises my medical leave arrangement or affects my military career, then so be it. Elena looked back at Dr. Blackthorne one final time. But I do regret that this hospital has an administrator who values appearances over substance, credentials over character, and bureaucracy over human compassion. The staff of this emergency department deserves better leadership. The patients who come here for care deserve better protection. And the community that depends on this hospital deserves better judgment than you've demonstrated tonight. The silence that followed Elena's words was profound and complete. Even the usual background noise of the hospital seemed to have stopped as everyone present absorbed the moral reckoning that had just taken place. Admiral Sterling stepped forward, his expression showing deep satisfaction with Elena's performance. Dr. Blackthorne, Admiral Sterling said quietly, I believe Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez has made her position abundantly clear. Now I think it's time for you to hear mine. Admiral Sterling's words hung in the air as he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second folder, this one marked with official government seals that made Dr. Blackthorne's face drain of what little color remained. Dr. Blackthorne, Admiral Sterling began, his voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority. Tonight's incident will be investigated by the Department of Defense Inspector General's Office, the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Review Board, and the Joint Commission on Hospital Accreditation. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez's treatment at this facility represents a serious breach of interagency cooperation protocols. Elena watched as Dr. Blackthorne seemed to age 10 years. In 10 seconds, the man who had been so confident in his authority just hours earlier now looked like someone facing the complete destruction of his professional career. Furthermore, Admiral Sterling continued, I'll be recommending that the Navy reconsider its policy of allowing decorated military medical officers to serve in civilian volunteer capacities. If this is how military personnel are treated when they attempt to contribute to civilian healthcare, then perhaps our service members' expertise would be better utilized in exclusively military settings. The implications of this statement rippled through the emergency room. Elena could see the staff members suddenly understanding that their hospital might lose access to the kind of medical expertise that Elena represented, not just Elena herself, but potentially other military medical professionals who might have contributed to civilian healthcare in the future. Maria Santa stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly but filled with determination. "Admiral Sterling, sir, I want you to know that Elena Dr. Vasquez has been the most competent and dedicated medical professional I've ever worked with. What happened tonight doesn't represent how this hospital staff feels about military service members." "That's right," Dr. Chun added, his voice carrying professional authority. "Dr. Vasquez's medical expertise has been invaluable to our cardiac emergency responses. Her diagnostic accuracy and treatment protocols have directly contributed to saving lives in this emergency department." Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest as one after another the staff members she had worked with stepped forward to defend her contributions and distance themselves from Dr. Blackthorn's actions. "Elena helped me through my first month here," Rebecca Foster said quietly. "She taught me more about emergency medicine in a few weeks than I learned in a year of nursing school. She never made me feel stupid for asking questions, and she always put patients first." Admiral Sterling listened to these testimonials with obvious satisfaction, but Elena could see that he wasn't finished delivering consequences. "Dr. Blackthorn," Admiral Sterling said, turning his attention back to the increasingly isolated hospital administrator, "I'm also going to be filing a formal complaint with the American Hospital Association regarding your conduct tonight. Specifically, your decision to prioritize bureaucratic compliance over emergency patient care, and your public humiliation of a medical professional who was providing life-saving treatment." Elena realized that Admiral Sterling was systematically ensuring that Dr. Blackthorn's career in hospital administration would be effectively over. The combination of federal investigations, professional complaints, and negative publicity would make him unemployable in any serious medical facility. "But," Admiral Sterling continued, his voice taking on a different tone, "I'm also here tonight to offer Riverside Memorial Hospital an opportunity." Elena looked up with surprise, sensing that Admiral Sterling had more in mind than simply defending her honor. "Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez's medical leave is scheduled to conclude in 3 months, Admiral Sterling explained. At that time, she'd be returning to active duty with a promotion to full colonel and assignment to head the Navy's new Civilian-Military Medical Cooperation Initiative. Elena felt her heart skip a beat. This was the first she had heard of any promotion or new assignment, and she realized that Admiral Sterling was creating possibilities in real time. "However," Admiral Sterling continued, "if Riverside Memorial Hospital were to offer Dr. Vasquez a position as Chief of Emergency Medicine, the Navy would be willing to consider a joint assignment that would allow her to serve both civilian and military medical communities." The suggestion sent shockwaves through the emergency room. Elena stared at Admiral Sterling with amazement, understanding that he was offering her something she had never dared to hope for, a way to continue serving in both military and civilian capacities. Dr. Chen stepped forward immediately. "Admiral, if that's a possibility, I would personally recommend Dr. Vasquez for any position she wanted at this hospital. Her qualifications far exceed our current emergency medicine leadership." Elena looked around the emergency room at the faces of staff members who had become her colleagues and friends over the past 3 months. She saw hope, excitement, and obvious support for the idea of her remaining at Riverside Memorial in an official capacity. "There's just one condition," Admiral Sterling said, looking directly at Dr. Blackthorn. any such arrangement would require that Dr. Vasquez work in an environment where her medical expertise is respected, her military service is honored, and her contributions are valued. She would need to work with hospital leadership that understands the difference between bureaucratic compliance and genuine patient care. The message was clear. Dr. Blackthorne would not be part of any future arrangement involving Elena's continued service at Riverside Memorial. As if summoned by the implications of Admiral Sterling's words, the hospital's board of directors began. Arriving in the emergency room, Elena watched as Dr. Patricia Hammond, the board chairwoman, approached Admiral Sterling with obvious concern about the federal attention that Riverside Memorial was suddenly receiving. Within an hour, the transformation was complete. Dr. Blackthorne had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The board had voted unanimously to offer Elena the position of Chief of Emergency Medicine with a joint civilian-military assignment. And Elena had accepted, with the understanding that she would be able to continue serving both military and civilian patients. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same emergency room where she had been humiliated and vindicated. But now she wore scrubs with Chief of Emergency Medicine embroidered on the pocket, and her office door displayed both her civilian medical credentials and her military commendations. The emergency department at Riverside Memorial had been transformed into a model of military-civilian medical cooperation. Elena had implemented the trauma protocol she had developed in combat zones, creating an emergency response system that had reduced patient mortality rates by 30%. She had established a training program where military medical personnel could gain civilian experience while civilian staff learned combat medicine techniques. Most importantly, she had created an environment where competence mattered more than credentials, where patient care took priority over bureaucratic compliance, and where every staff member, regardless of their background, was valued for their contributions, rather than judged by their appearance. On quiet nights, Elena still thought about that evening when her world had been turned upside down by a man who couldn't see past her simple clothes and volunteer status. But now she understood that sometimes the most painful experiences lead to the most meaningful transformations. George Hensley, whose heart attack had triggered the night's dramatic events, recovered completely and became one of Elena's most vocal supporters in the community. He often told people that he was alive because a woman in simple scrubs had cared more about his life than about hospital politics. Elena's story spread far beyond Riverside Memorial Hospital. Within a year, the Department of Defense had established similar civilian-military medical cooperation programs at hospitals across the country, ensuring that decorated military medical officers could continue serving communities while maintaining their military careers. But for Elena, the most important transformation was personal. She had learned that true service wasn't about hiding your abilities or downplaying your expertise. It was about using every skill you possessed to help others, regardless of whether anyone recognized or appreciated your contributions. Sometimes the greatest honor comes not from wearing medals, but from knowing that your presence made a difference in the lives of people who needed help. And sometimes the most meaningful victory is not defeating your enemies, but transforming the environment around you into something better than it was before. In the end, Elena's quiet service had created ripples that extended far beyond one small town hospital, proving that even in civilian clothes, true heroes find ways to change the world. 5 years later, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Military-Civilian Medical Cooperation, delivering the keynote address to an audience of hospital administrators, military medical officers, and healthcare policymakers from across the country. Her presentation title read, "When Service Transcends Uniform, Building Bridges Between Military and Civilian Healthcare." In the front row sat Admiral Sterling, now retired but serving as an advisor to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Beside him was Dr. Patricia Hammond, who had become a national advocate for military-civilian medical programs after witnessing the transformation at Riverside Memorial. Even Maria Santos was there, now the director of nursing at Riverside Memorial, and a frequent speaker about the importance of recognizing hidden talent in healthcare teams. 5 years ago, Elena began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium, I was kicked out of a hospital for helping patients. Tonight, I want to tell you about the extraordinary journey that began with that moment of humiliation and led to a revolution in how we think about medical service. Elena clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of George Hensley cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of the Riverside Memorial Military Civilian Medical Training Center, a facility that had become a model for hospitals nationwide. The man in this photograph is George Hensley, Elena continued. 5 years ago, he nearly died while hospital politics prevented him from receiving immediate care. Today, he serves on the board of directors at Riverside Memorial Hospital and chairs the National Coalition for Military Veteran Healthcare Integration. The audience murmured with appreciation as Elena shared the story of how George had become one of the most vocal advocates for military medical professionals transitioning to civilian healthcare roles. But George's story represents something larger than one man's recovery, Elena said, advancing to her next slide. It represents what happens when we choose to see potential instead of prejudice, when we value substance over appearance, and when we prioritize patient care over bureaucratic convenience. Elena's presentation included data that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. The Riverside Memorial model had been implemented in over 200 hospitals across 35 states. Patient outcomes in emergency departments had improved by an average of 40% where military-civilian cooperation programs had been established. More than 1,500 military medical professionals had successfully transitioned to dual civilian-military roles, bringing advanced trauma and emergency medicine expertise to communities that had never had access to such specialized care. Perhaps most importantly, Elena said, we've learned that the most valuable medical expertise often comes from unexpected places. Some of our most effective emergency medicine protocols were developed by Navy corpsmen who learned trauma care on submarines. Revolutionary pediatric emergency techniques came from Air Force medics who treated wounded children in conflict zones. Advanced cardiac resuscitation procedures were perfected by Army medical officers working in field hospitals with limited resources. Elena paused, looking out at an audience that included dozens of military medical professionals who had followed similar paths from hidden service to recognized expertise. The lesson of Riverside Memorial Hospital isn't just about one decorated officer who was temporarily misunderstood, Elena continued. It's about the thousands of military medical professionals who return to civilian communities every year, carrying expertise that could save countless lives if we're wise enough to recognize and utilize their talents. Elena's final slide showed a photograph taken just last month, the emergency department at Riverside Memorial during a mass casualty event following a severe tornado. The image captured military and civilian medical professionals working seamlessly together, treating victims with a level of coordination and expertise that had once seemed impossible. 5 years ago, Dr. Harrison Blackthorne believed that appearances and credentials were more important than competence and character, Elena sighed. Today, Dr. Blackthorne works as a file clerk for a medical insurance company in Delaware, while the emergency department he tried to fix has become a national model for excellence in patient care. The audience's laughter was knowing and appreciative. Elena had learned that sometimes the best way to honor her vindication was to acknowledge how completely the tables had turned. But this story isn't really about Dr. Blackthorne's fall or my personal vindication, Elena said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. It's about Maria Santos, who had the courage to trust a volunteer she barely knew. It's about Dr. Chun, who recognized medical expertise regardless of where it came from. It's about Admiral Sterling, who understood that protecting good people is more important than protecting institutional protocols. Elena's voice grew stronger as she reached her conclusion. Most of all, it's about every person in this audience who chooses to look beyond uniforms, beyond credentials, beyond appearances, to see the actual capabilities and character of the people around them. Because somewhere in your community, there's a veteran with medical training who's stocking shelves at a grocery store. There's a former military nurse who's driving for a rideshare company. There's a retired Navy corpsman who's working construction, carrying knowledge that could revolutionize your emergency department. Elena stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice carrying the passion that had driven her through 15 years of military service and 5 years of civilian military healthcare leadership. The question isn't whether these people exist in your communities. They do. The question is whether you'll have the wisdom to recognize them, the courage to trust them, and the vision to create opportunities for them to serve again. Elena's presentation concluded with thunderous applause, but the real measure of her impact would be seen in the months and years that followed, as more hospitals implemented military-civilian cooperation programs and more communities benefited from the hidden expertise of veterans who had been waiting for someone to recognize their value. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Elena received the National Healthcare Leadership Award for excellence in military-civilian cooperation. As she stood at the podium holding the crystal trophy, she thought about that night 5 years ago when she had been publicly humiliated for trying to help a patient. I want to dedicate this award to every person who has ever been underestimated because of how they looked, where they came from, or what credentials they carried, Elena said. Your worth isn't determined by what others see on the surface. Your value comes from what you choose to do with the gifts you've been given, and the difference you make in the lives of others. Elena looked out at an audience filled with people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of that night at Riverside Memorial Hospital. Military medical professionals who had found new purposes, civilian healthcare workers who had learned advanced techniques, patients whose lives had been saved by improved emergency care, and administrators who had learned to value substance over appearances. Sometimes, Elena concluded, the most important transformations begin with the simplest acts of service. You never know when your willingness to help someone else might change not just their life, but the entire world around you. As Elena left the stage that night, she carried with her the knowledge that her story had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become a movement that would continue long after she retired, ensuring that future generations of military medical professionals would never have to choose between serving their country and serving their communities. The quiet volunteer, who had once mopped floors while listening to hospital conversations, had become the voice of a revolution that was still transforming American healthcare. One hospital, one patient, and one act of recognition at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.